A millionaire saw a girl shivering with cold while selling flowers at the traffic light. When he opened the door of his limousine to help her, he was shocked by what the girl was able to do. Edward, a 65-year-old man with a long trajectory of achievements and influence, lived to command. He had always prided himself on never losing control, but that afternoon, during an important meeting, something out of the ordinary hit him. At the very moment he was about to finalize a business proposal, a sudden pain made him stop. His head throbbed like never before, a pressure that seemed to expand behind his eyes. He tried to ignore it, maintain his composure in front of the executives, but his hands began to tremble and his vision became strangely blurred. "I don't feel well," he mumbled, as if admitting it hurt him more than the pain. Every second the ground seemed to move away, until Edward finally succumbed, falling heavily to the floor of the room, to the horror of those present. The confusion was immediate. His colleagues around looked at each other and some tried to help him. Edward, dazed, could barely register what was happening as he was rushed to the hospital. There a battery of tests awaited him, a succession of machines and doctors that made him feel vulnerable like never before. Lying on the stretcher, his mind still hazy, Edward tried to ignore the growing anxiety, a strange feeling for someone used to controlling even the smallest detail. After a wait that seemed eternal, the doctor entered the room. Edward, already tired, looked up, trying to capture any clue in the doctor's face, but what he found was a somber expression. The man adjusted his glasses, and with a firm and direct voice uttered the words that would echo through every second of the following days. "Mr. Edward, I'm sorry to inform you that the tests indicate a massive cerebral aneurysm. It is about to rupture," said the doctor. Edward heard the words as if they came from afar, each syllable a stab. "What is the solution?" "I need you to do whatever is necessary," he replied, trying to maintain his decisive posture, but uncertainty was already insinuating itself in his voice. The doctor sighed, like someone who knows they will bring bad news. "There is surgery, sir, but the chance of survival is only 2%. Your chances of not surviving are 98%. The other alternative is to wait. You have at most 7 days, said the doctor. 7 days. Those words reverberated in his thoughts like a hammer, turning everything around him into an indistinct shadow. 7 days? You want to tell me that I won't be here in 7 days? That I have only that time to fix all the mistakes I made with my daughter? He mumbled, unable to hide his astonishment and disbelief. His empire, his life, everything he had built, now seemed like a fragile and worthless illusion. What mattered most to him was the time he lost building everything he had, while his daughter grew up, away from his presence. With a nod, he dismissed the doctor and closed his eyes, trying to process the crushing weight of that sentence. On the way back home, Edward was immersed in a heavy silence. Sitting in the back seat of his car, he looked at the rain streaming down the windows, forming trails that merged into an indistinct swirl. Each raindrop sliding down the glass seemed to mark the relentless passage of time. 7 days. My whole life, summed up in a week, he thought, feeling a deep sadness, a lament he had long avoided feeling. After all, he had always prioritized success, power, the certainty that nothing escaped his control instead of family. But now, he had no way to escape. Death awaited him, and he was about to face the only adversary against whom he could not win. The car stopped at a traffic light, and Edward, with a distant gaze, noticed a scene that caught his attention. Outside, in the heavy rain, a small figure struggled to stay on her feet. It was a girl, no more than 8 years old, holding flowers in an improvised bouquet, her hands almost blue with cold. She approached the stopped cars, offering the flowers desperately, the water streaming down her pale face. Edward watched, almost hypnotized, as the girl ran from car to car, begging for someone's attention, but no one seemed willing to help her. How can a child be alone in a storm like this? He thought, his heart involuntarily tightening. The light turned green, but Edward hesitated. The driver looked through the rearview mirror, awaiting instructions, while Edward couldn't take his eyes off the girl. She approached his car, hopeless, her lips trembling and her eyes full of tears, trying to make herself heard above the deafening noise of the rain. With an automatic gesture, Edward lowered the car window and the girl ran to him, holding the flowers tightly, as if that gesture were her last chance. "Please, mister." "Buy my flowers," she said, her voice broken, almost drowned out by the rain. "My grandfather. He's at home. He's not well. I need money for medicine. Please help me," she said, with tears welling up in her eyes. The sincerity in the girl's gaze was like a spark that burned through the layers of indifference Edward had built over the years. He felt a tightness in his chest, a sensation he hadn't experienced since the days of his youth, when he himself had known the struggle for survival. Edward stared at the girl, absorbing every detail of her frail figure. The wet hair, the pale face, and the eyes that seemed to reflect a pain he knew all too well. Where does this child draw such courage from, he thought, almost in admiration, and at the same time disturbed by a feeling of helplessness. He had spent his life building an empire, but there, faced with the desperate need of a girl, he felt miserably small. The girl held out the flowers, her hands icy, her fingers trembling. "No one wants to help me, sir. My grandfather needs his medicines. I just want to be able to help him," she murmured, her voice breaking into a thread of hope and fear. Edward, absorbing what he saw, felt torn between following his relentless logic and giving in to an impulse of compassion he had long forgotten. The driver looked at Edward, uncertain, and asked softly, "Sir, shall we continue?" The question brought Edward back, and he almost ordered them to move on, but something within him prevented him from leaving that child in the rain. "Wait, a little longer," he replied with a hoarse voice, unsure of the exact reason for his own response. Edward opened his wallet and took out some bills, handing them to the girl. She took them with trembling hands, looking at him with a mixture of gratitude and urgency. Thank you. "I have to run. He really needs the medicines," she said, clutching the bills to her chest. And before Edward could react, the girl turned and ran along the sidewalk, her small figure disappearing between the raindrops. Edward stood staring at the empty space where the girl had been, feeling a strange void consuming him from within. 7 days. And what have I really done with my life? Edward remained in the car, watching through the window as the girl's figure moved further and further away, disappearing into the rain. Something inside him prevented him from leaving her behind. Without hesitation, he leaned towards the driver and firmly ordered, "Follow that girl. I need to know if she's okay." The decision surprised the driver, but without questioning, he took the turn and accelerated to catch up with her. Edward stared straight ahead, feeling a strange urgency that he himself barely understood. "What am I doing?" "This is none of my business, but I need to go." When they caught up with her, Edward rolled down the car window and called out, his voice a little softer, "Hey girl, wait!" Sarah stopped running, her eyes wide with surprise, and approached with cautious steps. He looked at her for a moment, noticing how pale her face was and how her hair was drenched. "What's your name?" he asked, feeling he needed to establish some connection before doing anything else. She clutched the flowers tightly, as if they were her only security. "Sarah, sir." "My name is Sarah," she replied, hesitant, as if she wasn't used to talking to strangers. Edward nodded, her words echoing in his mind. "Sarah, I'm here to help. Come on, show me where your grandfather is," he said, trying to calm her. He stepped out of the car and extended his hand to her, which she hesitated before taking. I don't know if you'll be able to get there. It's a long way and my grandfather is very ill," Sarah murmured, her voice choked. Edward gently squeezed her hand. "I'll do what I can. Now show me the way, Sarah. We'll go together." The girl nodded, and the two of them went to the car. In the back seat, she seemed small and fragile, but her eyes shone with a determination that surprised Edward. He gave a slight smile, something he hadn't done in a long time. Maybe this is what I can still do. Maybe this is my last chance to be useful, he thought, as he watched the girl indicate the way. Sarah looked ahead, apprehensive, and spoke almost in a whisper. "What's your name, sir?" Edward was silent for a moment before answering. "Edward." "You can call me Edward," he said, his tone softer than he had ever used with anyone. The girl nodded, pronouncing his name softly, as if testing its sound. "Edward, thank you for helping me." The girl guided the driver along an increasingly isolated path, moving away from the avenues and entering dimly lit, deserted streets. "It's further ahead. Just go straight and turn there," she explained, pointing with her hands. Edward looked around, noticing how far away they were from everything. "You live very far away, Sarah. Why are you alone in the rain?" he asked, looking at her, feeling he needed to better understand the situation, but she just shrugged, seeming confused by the question. I only have my sick grandfather and no one else to help me, so I have to do this by myself. Finally, they arrived at the house, a small building hidden among dark, leaning trees that seemed to bend under the weight of the storm. Sarah got out of the car without waiting, running towards the door. Edward followed her, feeling strange and out of place, but with no intention of turning back. Upon entering, Edward was met with a desolate scene. On the floor of the living room lay Sarah's grandfather, a frail-looking old man lying on his back, with a blue face and motionless lips. He wasn't breathing. Sarah fell to her knees beside him, holding his hand as if somehow she could bring him back. Grandpa, wake up! I brought help, Grandpa. Her words were a desperate whisper, and Edward realized that time was against them. Edward crouched beside the old man, feeling the gravity of the situation tighten his chest. He's not breathing, Sarah. We're going to need to do something quickly, okay? He placed his hands on the man's chest and began to apply compressions, using all the strength he had. Each movement was a tremendous effort, for he didn't know if he was doing enough. Hold on, sir. Don't leave us now. Your granddaughter needs you, he murmured, as he concentrated on the rhythm of the compressions. Sarah stared fixedly, eyes wide and breath ragged, as she watched him try to revive her grandfather. You're going to save him, aren't you? He's going to start breathing again, right? She pleaded, her trembling voice breaking Edward's heart. He sighed, unsure how to respond. I'm trying, Sarah. I'm doing what I can. But we need to be patient, okay? She nodded, though the despair was visible in her eyes. Edward alternated between compressions and mouth-to-mouth breaths, his face growing increasingly sweaty despite the cold. He felt the tension building in his arms, and fatigue threatened to overwhelm him, but he couldn't stop now. Sarah held her grandfather's hand, her voice a whisper between sobs. Grandpa, please, don't leave me alone. You said you'd always take care of me, she said, and Edward heard her words like a knife in his own heart, renewing his efforts as if the man's life depended on every second he fought. Outside, the storm seemed to worsen, the wind battering against the house. Edward barely registered the sound of a falling tree nearby, blocking the path they'd taken to get there. He knew the driver had called an ambulance, but there weren't many options left now. We have to keep going. It's all we can do, Sarah, he murmured, as he continued the compressions, his voice hoarse and tired. Sarah looked at him, eyes brimming with tears, her voice almost inaudible. My grandpa Thomas is all I have. Please make him come back, she whispered, like a desperate prayer. Edward felt the weight of responsibility like never before and tried to hide the despair that threatened to engulf him. I'm trying, Sarah. I promise I won't give up. Not as long as there's a chance, he replied, feeling his own body threatening to give out. The compressions continued, but Edward felt increasingly drained, his head throbbing and arms aching. He knew he needed to keep going, but his own body seemed to be collapsing. Sarah, on her knees beside him, clutched her grandfather's hand tightly. Please don't go away, Grandpa. I still need you here, she sobbed. And Edward knew he couldn't stop now, for somehow her pain had become his own. Suddenly, a sharp pain radiated through Edward's head, an intense sensation that seemed to overtake his whole body. He tried to resist, but it was as if an electric current was coursing through him from head to toe. The room around him seemed to spin, and he felt his muscles weaken. The world blurred, and before he could react, Edward collapsed onto Thomas's chest, his consciousness ebbing away like a final breath. Sarah let out a scream of horror as she saw Edward crumple, his body motionless as if all effort had abandoned him. The house echoed with the sound of the storm and the desperate cries of a girl who, for the first time, seemed truly alone. Sarah looked at the two still bodies in front of her, heart pounding, breath trembling. Edward and her grandfather Thomas lay side by side, both unmoving, both desperately needing help. Trying to contain her panic, she picked up the phone with shaking hands and dialed emergency, her voice broken by rain and fear. Please, I need an ambulance. My grandfather and the man who tried to help him are both in really bad shape. Please come quickly, she pleaded, tears streaming down her face. The operator on the other end tried to calm her. We're sending a unit to your location, dear. But with the heavy rain and blocked road, it might take a little longer than normal. Try to stay calm and check if they're both breathing. The ambulance is on its way. she said, increasing Sarah's panic. "How long? They need help now." She looked at her grandfather, then at Edward, unsure what to do. But the call dropped before the operator could give her an answer. The minutes seemed to drag on, each second a torment. "They'll get here. They have to get here. I just need you both to stay with me until then," she whispered, trying to encourage the two unconscious men, though she knew they couldn't hear her. The rain worsened outside, and the sound of heavy drops battering the roof made the silence inside the house even more frightening. Sarah felt small and powerless, but she didn't want to give up. She knelt beside her grandfather, trying to remember the motions Edward had made. She positioned her hands on his chest, pressing down hard, desperate for him to start breathing again. "Please, Grandpa, stay with me." "I can't lose you too," she begged, tears mingling with the rain on her face. As she performed the compressions, her gaze kept turning to Edward, whose face was pale and still. The man she barely knew but who had risked everything to save her grandfather lay there vulnerable and with no one to help him. "I don't know how to help you, but you have to be strong," she murmured, unsure who else to turn to. She tried to maintain the rhythm of the compressions, feeling her arms ache, but determination kept her from stopping. Finally, the sound of sirens rang out in the distance, and Sarah felt a glimmer of hope rekindle within her. "They're coming. They're going to save you," she whispered, her face brightening as she looked at the two, wishing her promise would be true. The ambulance, however, was still far away, and she knew time was critical. Desperately, she increased the pressure on Thomas's chest, as if she could force him to breathe again. "Please, Grandpa, you promised you'd never leave me alone." The ambulance lights finally illuminated the house entrance, and Sarah ran out, signaling for the paramedics to come in. "They're here, please, help! They are bad," she shouted, leading the team inside. The paramedics quickly began assessing the two men, and Sarah watched the scene with wide eyes, her heart pounding. "Please, you have to save them. They are all I have now." One of the paramedics began performing resuscitation on Thomas, while the other examined Edward. The serious demeanor of both indicated that the situation was grave, and Sarah bit her lips, fearing the worst. "Miss, we'll do our best." "But both are in critical condition," said one of the paramedics, with a look that tried to convey empathy, although the seriousness of the situation was evident. Sarah clenched her fists, feeling helpless, but knew she could do nothing but hope and wait. The transport to the ambulance was difficult, with the rain still intense and the path blocked by the fallen tree. The paramedics had to detour, carrying Edward and Thomas's bodies with as much care as possible. Sarah followed closely, her gaze fixed on her grandfather and Edward, unable to look away. "They can't die. Not now," she thought, fighting back tears. She got into the ambulance beside them, holding her grandfather's hand as if it were the last anchor of her hope. During the journey, the atmosphere inside the ambulance was tense and filled with urgency. Thomas suffered a sudden cardiac arrest, and the paramedics began applying the defibrillator, trying to reverse the situation. "Come on, sir. Stay with us." "The girl needs you," one of them murmured, while Sarah watched with wide eyes, feeling her heart race with fear. "Don't give up, Grandpa. I'm here," she whispered, holding his hand tightly. Edward lay on the stretcher, his face pale and his eyes closed, motionless. The monitor beside him showed his intracranial pressure was rising rapidly, indicating that the aneurysm, a dangerous bulge in a brain artery, could rupture at any moment. Sarah didn't know exactly what the doctors were monitoring, but understood enough to know that Edward was at great risk. She watched him for a moment, trying to convey some calmness, even though she knew he was unconscious. "Edward, please, you helped me. So fight to live. Don't give up now," she whispered, hoping that somehow he could hear her. The ambulance crossed the city under a torrential rain, and each kilometer seemed to take an eternity. Sarah felt torn between the fear of losing her grandfather and the gratitude for Edward, who had put his own life at risk trying to help them. At one point, she heard a shrill beep from her grandfather's monitor, and the paramedics rushed over, saying something that made her freeze. He had suffered another cardiac arrest. Sarah watched helpless as the paramedics tried to resuscitate him with chest compressions and a defibrillator. "This can't be happening. It can't be real," she thought, feeling her eyes burning from holding back the tears. After what seemed like an eternity, They arrived at the hospital. Sarah watched, her heart heavy, as the paramedics took her grandfather and Edward straight to the emergency room. She stood still, watching the long corridors as the doctors' faces disappeared quickly, and a sense of emptiness enveloped her. It was as if a part of her was drifting away with them. Grandpa, Edward. "Please stay with me," she murmured softly as fear and uncertainty began to dominate her thoughts. Moments later, one of the doctors approached and informed her that the two were in critical condition. Edward needed emergency surgery with a high risk of survival to prevent the aneurysm from rupturing, but the only surgeon who could operate, Dr. Harris, was in another surgery. Sarah felt despair grow as she heard that. "But Edward needs help now. He doesn't have time to wait," she protested, her voice trembling with tension. The nurse beside her held her by the shoulders, giving her a look of compassion. "Dear, we'll do everything we can. But you need to be strong now," she said, trying to convey some calm to the girl who could barely hold back her tears. Sitting in the waiting room, Sarah could hardly think of anything other than Edward and her grandfather. Edward was a man who had everything, a stranger who had stopped to help someone like her, expecting nothing in return. He had risked it all, and now he was there, in a silent fight for his own life. "Why did you do that, Edward?" she thought, trying to understand what had led him to do something so altruistic. "I can't lose you both. I can't," she murmured to herself, as the responsibility Edward had left in her hands weighed like an anchor. Later, a nurse entered the room with a serious demeanor and informed that Thomas's condition had worsened during transport. He had suffered multiple cardiac arrests, and each one further decreased his chances of recovery. "We're doing everything we can, but it's a very delicate situation," the nurse explained in a tone that seemed to be preparing Sarah for the worst. She felt a chill down her spine, but took a deep breath, trying to keep hope alive. Shortly after, Sarah was taken to the room where the two men were. The sight of the two made her shudder. Her grandfather was connected to several machines, and each beat of his heart seemed a fragile whisper. On the other side, Edward was even paler, and one of the doctors mentioned that the pressure inside his head was so high that the aneurysm could rupture at any moment. Sarah looked at them, each detail revealing how critical the situation was. They need help now. There can be no more delay, she thought, as a growing panic took hold of her. When the neurosurgeon Dr. Harris entered the room, the tension in the air became even heavier. He looked at the monitors and at Sarah, who stared at him with a mixture of fear and hope. Dr. Harris took a deep breath before speaking, choosing his words carefully. "Sarah, the situation is critical for both of them. Your grandfather is losing his recovery ability every minute, and Mr. Edward, the bleeding in his brain is worsening. I can only operate on one of them now, but your grandfather's health insurance coverage—" He let the words die. The silence that followed was almost unbearable, and Sarah felt a lump tighten in her throat, unable to comprehend the cruelty of that choice. She fell to her knees before the doctor, her face wet with tears. "Please, Dr. Harris, save them both. Please help my grandfather. He's my only family," she pleaded, her voice choked with despair. The doctor looked at her with sad eyes and crouched down a little, placing a hand on her shoulder. "I understand, Sarah, but the surgery is complex and has a high cost. It's something the hospital needs to ensure before performing the procedure." Dr. Harris's words cut Sarah like a knife. She had no way to pay for such an expensive surgery, and she knew the hospital wouldn't perform the operation without payment. "No, but I have nothing else than this." "Please, there must be another way," she murmured, almost voiceless, handing him the notes from the roses she had tried to sell earlier. But the doctor shook his head. It was far from the sufficient amount for payment. Reality was harsh and relentless, and she felt a sense of helplessness she had never experienced before. "I need help. Please, someone has to help." While Sarah tried to understand the gravity of the situation, Edward slowly opened his eyes. He blinked, confused, and his vision adjusted until he finally saw Sarah kneeling and crying. While the doctor tried to explain the situation, the scene awakened in him a sense of urgency. "Sarah, what's happening?" he asked, his voice weak but full of concern. She stood up quickly and held Edward's hand, her gaze laden with emotion. "Edward, they said my grandfather needs surgery, but it's very expensive, and I can't afford it." Her words were almost a whisper, And Edward felt the weight of that revelation. Without hesitation, he squeezed her hand and looked at the doctor. "Dr. Harris, I will make the necessary payment. Her grandfather's surgery must be done before anything else," he declared, trying to keep his voice steady despite the throbbing pain in his head. The doctor nodded, surprised, and handed him the clipboard with the documents for authorization. "It's an expensive and risky procedure, Mr. Edward. We need your signature to confirm payment." Edward nodded, trying to push the pain aside and stay focused. He took the pen with trembling hands, determined to do whatever it took to save Sarah's grandfather. "Don't worry, Sarah. Your grandfather will get the help he needs," he said, forcing a smile, trying to calm her. Sarah watched him with immense gratitude, but also with evident concern. "Edward, are you okay? You don't have to do this. What if this harms you?" she asked, her voice trembling. Edward looked at her with an expression that mingled pain and compassion. "I've made my decision, Sarah. Your grandfather needs help now, and I'm here to make sure of that," he replied, feeling the weight of every word. As Edward held the pen and began signing the documents, the pain in his head intensified, as if his own body was warning him of the risk he was taking. He took a deep breath, trying to resist, but his vision began to blur and his fingers weakened, the pen almost slipping from his hand. "I need to sign this," he muttered, determined to complete the signature, even as his body threatened to give way. The instant he put the pen to paper, an unbearable pain exploded in his head, and his body began to shake uncontrollably. The seizure hit him violently, and he fell back, his face contorted in pain as the pen slipped from his fingers. Sarah screamed and tried to hold him, her eyes wide with terror. "Edward, no, please, stay with me. You have to resist." Edward's body convulsed violently, each spasm seeming like a final blow to his resistance. The doctors around him mobilized quickly, while Sarah, her face pale and eyes wide, watched helplessly. "Edward, no! You have to stay with me." "You can't leave me now," she murmured, fear turning her voice into a desperate whisper. The doctors gently pushed her aside as they tried to stabilize Edward. She stepped back, too weak to protest, watching as the medical team worked in a frenzy. Edward began to deteriorate, the clear sign that the aneurysm had finally ruptured. The doctors exchanged grave looks, the urgency etched on every face. "We're losing him," said one of the doctors, holding his breath as he checked Edward's pupils. They were dilated, indicating possible imminent brain death. Sarah, leaning against the wall of the room, felt her heart clench as she saw the doctors debate the situation. With every second, the situation worsened, and one of the doctors, with a look of sorrow, murmured to his colleague beside him, "If the pressure keeps rising, he won't make it. We need to consider declaring brain death." The words were spoken in a low tone, almost a whisper so as not to reach Sarah's ears. But she heard them, feeling the ground disappear from beneath her feet. Brain death. No, it can't be true, she thought, her heart racing in despair. As the debate intensified, one of the doctors suggested a last attempt at intervention, but others disagreed, arguing that Edward's condition was too critical for any procedure. "He's practically without brain activity. There's not much we can do," argued one of them, looking at the monitors showing the nearly flat line of his vital signs. Sarah continued to watch, tears streaming down her face. "He risked everything, and now I'm going to lose them both," she murmured, feeling her heart tighten with every second. However, the team decided to give it one last chance while awaiting a final decision on Edward's state. On the other side, in the operating room, Thomas's situation was also worsening. During the procedure, his heart stopped, and the team rushed to use the defibrillator, trying to resuscitate him. Sarah, who was alone in the waiting room, didn't know what was happening with her grandfather, but felt a deep anguish that only grew with each passing moment. Leaning against the cold wall of the waiting room, Sarah clasped her hands and began to pray silently, asking for a miracle. "God, please don't let me lose my grandfather. And Edward too. They're all I have now. I need them with me, please." The tears kept streaming down her face, and she closed her eyes, trying to focus on her prayer, as if it were the only thing that could keep her steady at that moment. Edward's cerebral pressure continued to rise, and one of the doctors finally sighed, looking at the monitors. "We're out of time. We can't wait any longer," he said, with a tone of resignation that made the gravity of the situation clear. They began to prepare the equipment, while the monitor line wavered. The silence was broken only by the sounds of the hospital and the irregular rhythm of the monitors. "Edward, please, fight. Don't leave us," murmured one of the nurses, trying not to lose hope. In the operating room next door, the team continued trying to resuscitate Thomas, but the heart monitor showed a flat line. "Get the defibrillator ready. We'll try one more time," yelled the surgeon as the team moved quickly around the table. The sound of the machine being charged filled the environment, and Sarah, still praying in the waiting room, remained unaware of what was happening, but felt a sense of dread that seemed to grow with every passing moment. With her eyes closed, Sarah clasped her hands tighter, intensifying her prayer. "Please, Goddie, give them one more chance. I have no one else but them. Don't take this away from me now," she whispered, trying to hold back her tears, while her mind refused to accept the idea of losing the two people who meant everything to her. She felt small and helpless, alone in that hospital, surrounded by uncertainty. Back in Edward's room, the doctors were trying to stabilize him, but the situation was out of control. The hemorrhage had spread rapidly, and the monitor showed he was slipping into a deep coma. One of the doctors made a last effort to reverse the situation, but the monitor's line began to drop, indicating his brain activity was almost nil. "He won't make it. We're losing him," muttered the lead doctor with an expression of sorrow. At the moment Edward slipped into a deep coma, a scream echoed from the operating room next door. "Defibrillator, quick! We need to resuscitate him." The diagnosis of Edward's brain death was a relentless blow. Sarah, alone in the corridor, couldn't accept the reality the doctors had just confirmed. They had said there was nothing more to be done, that Edward's body was there, but the life she had known in him had been extinguished. Tears streamed down her face as she tried to process the idea that the man who had risked everything for her grandfather was now in a state from which he might never return. "No, it can't be true. He can't leave me now," she murmured, wrapping her arms around herself to contain her despair. Sitting on a cold, empty waiting bench, Sarah clutched her own body, trying to prevent panic from consuming her. She wanted to scream, to beg, to do anything for someone to hear her, for the doctors to change their minds. However, all she could do was remain there, alone, watching the door of the room where Edward was. "Edward, please, you can't leave me. You promised you'd stay," she whispered, her voice trembling as if her words could somehow reach him. Then the doctor checked the papers with Edward's signature, which he had signed with difficulty, trying to save the girl's grandfather, confirming the decision to operate on Thomas first. With the authorization in hand, he hurried to bring Thomas to the operating room, leaving Edward under intensive care as his condition worsened. Sarah, watching every move of the team, felt her heart crushed by fear and gratitude. "He did this for me. He really did," she thought, unable to contain the flow of tears streaming down her face. As she anxiously awaited the outcome of her grandfather's surgery, Sarah paced the corridor, her steps short and hesitant, her heart pounding. At every sound of footsteps, she turned, hoping to see a doctor emerging with news. Time seemed to drag on, and the fear of losing them both grew with every second. "Please, Grandpa, you have to come back. And Edward, you have to fight too," she whispered, closing her eyes and clasping her hands in a desperate prayer. Hours later, finally, a doctor emerged from the operating room, approaching her with a tired and serious expression. Sarah immediately lifted her gaze, tears streaming endlessly as she awaited the news she so dreaded. "Miss Sarah, your grandfather survived the surgery. We did what was in our power, but he is in a very serious condition. He will need a lot of care, and it is possible that the after effects may be permanent," the doctor explained solemnly, while Sarah stared at him with a mixture of relief and anguish. His words hit her hard. The relief of knowing her grandfather was alive brought a moment of peace, but the idea that he might never be the same again filled her heart with sadness. "Thank you, Doctor. Thank you for not giving up on him," she whispered, wiping away her tears as she tried to find the strength to accept that reality. "Grandpa, you'll come back, I know you will. I'll be here for you," she murmured to herself, trying to convince herself that there was still hope. Sarah, still lost in her thoughts, noticed a figure at the end of the corridor. A tall woman with blonde hair falling in disheveled strands across her face walked hurriedly, her expression marked by worry and her eyes swollen from crying. The woman's expression was one of pure despair, and Sarah realized she seemed to be urgently seeking information. One of the nurses approached the woman, touching her shoulder and saying something softly. Sarah heard Edward's name and her heart skipped a beat. She must be his daughter. It can only be her, she thought, feeling a glimmer of hope grow inside her. The nurse gestured for Jessica, Edward's daughter, to follow a corridor that led to the room where her father was. Sarah, unable to contain herself, ran toward the woman, her heart racing with the idea that this could be the only person with the power to save Edward. As she approached, Sarah hesitated for a moment, but her need to fight for Edward's life made her ignore her fear. "Mom, please wait," Sarah called out, her voice trembling. Jessica stopped abruptly, looking down and facing the girl who was now standing before her. Without quite knowing how to explain, Sarah clasped her hands together, her face full of tears, and said, "I am Sarah, your father. He helped me. He risked everything for me and my grandfather," she whispered, her voice barely audible but laden with pain. Jessica, confused, tried to understand the girl's words, unaware of what Edward had done. "What do you mean, child?" "My father risked everything. For you?" Jessica murmured, still uncomprehending. Sarah nodded, trying to hold back her tears. "My name is Sarah. I was selling flowers. My grandfather was very ill, and no one stopped to help. But your father, he stopped and he offered to help. He even signed the authorization for my grandfather to have surgery first," Sarah explained, her voice choked up. "I am Jessica. I have just received news about my father's health condition and came to turn off the machines. That was his wish. My father always said that. He didn't want to live like that," Jessica explained, but the girl knelt down in front of her, clutching her legs in desperation. "Please, Mum, don't turn off the machines. He may still come back. He deserves a chance," she implored, her eyes full of pleading. Jessica took a deep breath, trying to understand the plea of that child she hardly knew, and crouched down to her. "But why did he do that for you? Why did my father risk everything like that?" she questioned, trying to comprehend the bond that somehow seemed to unite Edward to that girl. Sarah, her voice broken by crying, answered, "He was the only one to stop, the only one who helped me when no one else stopped to listen to me. He risked his life to save my grandfather. He gave me hope." Jessica remained silent, absorbing Sarah's words and feeling the weight of a decision too difficult to be made immediately. Sarah's eyes desperately sought a sign that she would give in, that she wouldn't make an irreversible decision. "Please, I know he's still there. He's strong. He needs this chance. Just give him a little more time," she pleaded, her voice a whisper laden with pain and hope. At that moment, an alert began to sound from the monitor next to Edward, interrupting the silence with a shrill and relentless sound. Sarah and Jessica turned at the same time to face the room where Edward was, as the alarm continued to echo, like an approaching death sentence. Sarah's despair increased, and she looked at Jessica with frightened eyes as if her own life depended on that decision. "Please, he's trying to fight. I know he is. Don't let him go," she whispered, as tears began to stream down her face again. Jessica, still without an answer, breathed heavily. The machines sustaining Edward began to fail one by one, and Sarah felt as if with each sound, a part of her hope was torn away. She squeezed Jessica's hand harder, almost pleading for a miracle. The constant sound of the machines sustaining Edward rose to an alarming tone. The monitors, which until then had had an irregular and constant line, now emitted broken noises, with peaks that arose and disappeared as if the system itself was on the verge of giving up. Sarah, still kneeling beside Jessica, noticed the strange sound coming from the room where Edward was. Her heart raced and she stood up, her eyes fixed on the equipment that was beginning to show warning signs. "Please, this can't be happening," murmured Sarah, feeling the fear grow with every shrill sound of the alarms. She held her own chest, where a suffocating tightness was beginning to form. Despair took hold of her, and her breathing became short and irregular. The sound of the failing machines was like a countdown to the worst. "Edward, you have to hold on. You can't leave me now," she whispered, each word an effort to maintain hope. Gradually, Sarah's breathing became heavier, and she began to feel a familiar pressure in her lungs, as if the air refused to enter. It was a feeling she knew well, an asthma attack that threatened to intensify with the growing panic. "No, not now," she murmured, trying to control her breathing. But the sound of the failing equipment seemed to make everything impossible. She gasped for air, but the fear left her increasingly breathless. Jessica, noticing the girl's condition, placed a hand on her shoulder, trying to comfort her. "Calm down, Sarah. You need to breathe slowly. Try to relax, okay?" she said, trying to maintain control while her own heart raced with fear. Sarah looked at her with wide eyes, trying to follow the advice, but the tightness in her chest and increasingly short breaths made it clear she was on the verge of an intense attack. "I can't breathe," she whispered, the words coming out in a thin voice as she tried in vain to contain the despair. Suddenly, the sound of a louder alarm echoed through the corridor, indicating that Edward's situation had worsened even further. Doctors and nurses ran into the room trying to adjust the equipment and stabilize his critical condition. Sarah watched from afar, unable to breathe properly, but equally unable to look away. "Edward, you have to fight. You promised me you'd stay," she whispered, each word weaker as if the air itself was failing her. At the height of the asthma attack, Sarah began to feel dizzy. The corridor around her seemed to spin. The sound of the hurried footsteps of the doctors mingled with the echo of the equipment, and everything seemed to turn into an indistinct blur. Trying to maintain focus, she clutched her chest, struggling to force the air to enter, but panic completely enveloped her. "I need to breathe. I need help," she thought, as her body trembled and her vision darkened. In the midst of the confusion, Jessica shouted for a nurse when she saw Sarah begin to falter. But at the same instant, a distinct sound of an explosion echoed through the hospital. The lights began to flicker, and within seconds everything plunged into complete darkness. A total blackout took over the building, leaving the corridors and operating rooms without any source of light. The sound of the machines fell silent, and the emptiness of the darkness amplified everyone's despair. The feeling of panic increased, and Sarah, lost in the dark and breathless, tried to hold on to the little air she could get, but her body didn't respond. The emergency lights tried to flicker on, but quickly went out when the generators failed completely. Jessica and Sarah, immersed in the dark, felt the despair increase. Sarah's breathing was even shorter, and her chest rose and fell uncontrollably as she tried unsuccessfully to contain the asthma attack. "I can't lose my breath now," she thought, each attempt to breathe a monumental effort. Light, hurried steps echoed through the empty corridor, and Sarah felt a gentle hand touch her shoulder. It was a nurse who had struggled to locate her in the darkness. "Here, take this, dear," she whispered, putting an asthma pump in her hand. Sarah held the inhaler tightly, as if it were a lifeline, and administered a dose of relief amid the chaos. Little by little, she began to breathe more easily, feeling the air finally fill her lungs. Thank you," she murmured, feeling a glimmer of hope amid the crisis. But before she could say anything else, the nurse was already back on her feet, her face grave. "I need to run to help other patients. We are without power, and many depend on essential equipment," she said, her haste evident. With one last worried look at Sarah and Jessica, the nurse disappeared down the corridor, leaving Jessica and Sarah alone. Growing concern took over both of them, and they looked at each other, sharing a silent fear of what they might find in Edward's room. Sarah, still panting, held the small toy flashlight she carried in her pocket. "Let's go. We need to see how he is. My grandfather isn't using machines, but—" "Edward, we have to go," she whispered, looking at Jessica with a determination she could barely maintain, but which made her move forward. Her heart pounding, Jessica nodded, swallowing the fear that threatened to take over her. "Yes, we need to make sure he's okay," she replied, trying to keep her voice steady as they walked together down the dark corridor. The beam from Sarah's flashlight was weak, swaying with each step, but it was enough to light the way to Edward's room. As they approached the door, the silence inside the room was almost suffocating. There was no sound of the ventilator or the rhythmic beep of monitors. Jessica felt her heart tighten and gripped the manual ventilation mask in her hands, prepared for the worst. If the ventilator stopped, he might be without air, she murmured to herself, her gaze fixed on the door, trying to muster the courage to enter. Jessica took a deep breath, letting instinct and a courage she didn't know she possessed take over. Guided by touch and instinct, she carefully positioned the manual ventilation mask over her father's face. Each breath she provided, Edward was a silent battle in the darkness, a desperate act to keep him alive. Sarah pointed the weak beam of light toward Edward, trying to illuminate his face enough for Jessica to see what she was doing. The flashlight's glow was minimal, but at that moment it seemed like a source of hope. "It's all we have." "But it's enough. I know we'll make it," Sarah murmured almost to herself as she held the flashlight with determination, gripping the small object in her trembling hands. With each movement, Jessica adjusted the rhythm of manual ventilation, compressing the mask to simulate the breathing the ventilator no longer provided. "Edward, you need to fight. I'm here." "I'm here with you," she whispered, tears silently streaming as she tried to ignore the growing fear. Each compression seemed to tear a part of her away, but Jessica remained steadfast, focused on maintaining the flow of oxygen to her father. The silence of the room was broken only by the sound of the mask being squeezed and released, and Jessica's constant effort to provide air to Edward. The beam of the flashlight swayed slightly as Sarah, immersed in the effort to help, stood firm, though fear clawed at her chest. "Come on, Edward. We're not giving up on you and Grandpa," Sarah whispered, trying to keep hope alive for herself and Jessica. With every second that passed, the desperation grew, and Jessica alternated between looking at her father and at Sarah, who continued to hold the flashlight with all her might. Jessica's hands trembled, but she forced herself to continue, focused on each movement. "He can still come back, and he needs to fight. Please, Edward, don't give up now," she whispered, feeling the weight of each word and the tension taking over her own muscles. As time passed, the ventilation mask became more difficult to handle. The emotional and physical weight of the situation was almost unbearable, but Jessica continued, determined not to give up. The minutes that passed seemed like hours, and fatigue began to overcome her determination. "I can't give up, he can't give up," she thought, as tears welled up uncontrollably, blurring her vision. Noticing Jessica's exhaustion, Sarah approached her, keeping the flashlight steady toward Edward's face. "Mrs. Jessica, I can help. I can hold the mask while you rest," she offered, her voice soft but filled with a kind of courage that only desperation had granted her. Jessica hesitated, looking at the girl with surprise and recognition, but shook her head. "No, I can't risk it. He needs the air now, and I need to keep going." As the effort became almost impossible, Jessica felt her heart racing, and the ventilation movements became faster and more desperate. "Please, Edward, listen to me. You need to keep breathing. Don't go now, don't leave me like this," she whispered, despair finally taking over her voice. Suddenly, after an eternity immersed in darkness, the hospital lights flickered. First weak and hesitant, as if the system wasn't sure it could resume its function, but then they gained strength, illuminating Edward's room completely. Jessica and Sarah looked at each other, momentary relief visible on their faces. "The lights are back. Edward, this is a good sign," Jessica said, trying to believe that this small victory meant everything would be all right. But the calm was brief. Shortly after, Edward's room door opened abruptly, and a nurse rushed in, breathless, bringing bad news. Thomas, Sarah's grandfather. He had a sudden complication and needs immediate attention. "We're doing what we can, but things don't look good at all," she said, her worried gaze turning to the girl. Sarah felt a chill run down her spine upon hearing this. "No. He was getting better, he survived the surgery," she muttered, her eyes watering and her heart crushed by this new threat. Sarah looked at Jessica, feeling a desperate need to do something, anything, to help her grandfather. "I need to be with him, Mrs. Jessica. I need to see my grandfather," she said, her voice trembling. Jessica nodded, understanding the girl's anguish, but at the same time, her heart was torn between Edward and Thomas. "Go, Sarah. I'll be here with my father," she replied, squeezing the girl's hand in a gesture of support. "I know he's going to be all right." "We need to believe," Jessica muttered, almost to herself. As soon as Sarah left to meet her grandfather, Jessica turned all her attention back to Edward. The hospital's backup system was operating precariously, flickering as if each second of operation was hanging by a thread. Edward's ventilator had started working again, but intermittently. making Jessica remain on alert, holding the mask ready to continue manual ventilation if necessary. She felt a wave of exhaustion taking over her body, but pushed away any thought of weakness. "Dad, you can't leave me now. I need you to fight, please," she whispered, fear imprinted in every word. In the hallway, Sarah made her way to the room where Thomas was being treated. Inside, the doctors were working to the limit, trying to reverse the complication her grandfather was facing. Sarah stopped at the door, her hands clasped in prayer, her breath held as she watched the team fight for his life. "Grandpa, you promised you'd be with me. Don't give up now," she murmured, her voice choked with emotion. She closed her eyes, as if her prayer could reach her grandfather and give him an extra strength to resist. Thomas's situation seemed to be worsening, and the medical team exchanged tense glances, aware that they were on the brink of the impossible. The hospital's energy flickered, the equipment blinked, and for a moment Thomas's monitor showed a sharp drop in his vitals. One of the doctors rushed to adjust the machines, and Sarah shrank back, feeling despair tightening her heart. "No, not him too," she muttered, her hands trembling. Back in Edward's room, Jessica noticed that her father's ventilator was starting to emit warning signals. Once again, the system seemed to be failing. She quickly grabbed the manual ventilation mask, resolutely resuming mechanical breathing. Each movement of pressure on the mask was a physical and emotional effort, but she refused to stop. "Dad, I'm here. Please, don't leave me now." "I can't lose you," Jessica said, as she pumped air in a rhythm that resembled the beating of her own heart. The hospital lights flickered again, and Jessica feared the system would fail completely. But at the same time, she felt there was no room to give up. It was as if, in that moment of fragility, she and Edward were more connected than ever before. Each compression was a silent prayer, a promise that he could still come back. "Dad, I know your chances are impossible, but I believe in miracles. We're going to save you. We have to save you." Suddenly, after what seemed like an eternity immersed in shadows and uncertainties, the hospital lights flickered, hesitant, as if the energy system wasn't fully restored yet. In Edward's room, the flickering light revealed his pale, motionless face, and the monitors around him emitted irregular beeps, oscillating dangerously. Jessica held his hand, feeling the coldness of his skin against hers, while the mechanical noises in the room echoed like an impending sentence. Each time the beep of the monitors failed, Jessica felt a tightness in her chest, as if the very air was being stolen from her. "Dad, I'm here with you. Please come back. I know you didn't want to be connected to machines, I know that. You wanted to live, not just survive. But how will I cope without you? Don't leave me," she whispered, her voice a fragile thread, almost swallowed by the unsteady sound of the machines. She knew Edward's condition was critical, but desperation prevented her from considering the possibility of losing him. "You're strong. Please keep fighting," she murmured, trying to convey hope, even as her own was unraveling. The door to the room opened, and the doctor entered, his face serious and his eyes filled with a sad compassion. Jessica knew he brought a difficult decision. He approached, and his expression conveyed the gravity of the moment. "Mrs. Jessica, we need to talk about your father's condition," he said, his voice low and careful. Jessica pressed her lips, feeling an anguish that seemed to suffocate her. "Doctor, please, do everything you can to save him and bring him back," she pleaded, as she tried to hold back the tears that threatened to overflow. The doctor paused, as if searching for the best way to explain the situation. "Your father is in a vegetative state, but his health condition is extremely delicate. His vital signs are fluctuating, and the situation is very serious. Without immediate intervention, he will not survive much longer. But even if I perform the surgery, he will only have a 2% chance of survival and may still not wake up from the coma." "I'm sorry, ma'am," he said, each word a blow. Jessica felt the world around her crumbling, absorbing the news, trying to find some fragment of hope where there apparently was none. 2%. Was that all he had left? The bare minimum fraction of hope? How can I decide something like that? If that's the only chance, then do the surgery. He needs that chance. I don't care if it's 2%, 1%, or a non-existent chance, as long as we can. Fight for him," she said, forcing herself to keep her voice steady. The doctor looked at Jessica with understanding eyes, but his expression hardened. I want you to understand the risks. The surgery has only a 2% chance of success. He may not make it, he explained, his voice cautious. Is there no other alternative? She asked in an attempt to find a way out that wasn't so devastating. But the doctor only shook his head. Unfortunately, no. Without the surgery, he won't survive much longer. But even with the surgery, there are great risks, especially with the unstable power. If there's another blackout during the procedure, the chances drop to practically zero, he explained, his tone heavy, laden with the cruel truth that Jessica now had to face. The choice seemed impossible, but Jessica knew she couldn't just let him go. She clung to her father's hand, feeling the faint warmth that remained, the only sign of life that connected her to him. Dad. I don't know if it's the right choice, but I can't give up on you, she thought as the tears finally began to stream down her face. The image of her father, always so strong and present, now became a fragile memory, and she knew she needed to fight, even if the price was high. Jessica looked at the doctor, trying to muster the courage needed to respond. I understand the risks, doctor, but he deserves that chance, however small it may be. I can't let him go without trying, she stated, and her voice, despite the tremor, sounded firm. The doctor nodded with an expression that mixed respect and concern. Then we'll prepare for the surgery, but please be prepared for all possibilities. With his condition and the hospital circumstances, I cannot promise that everything will turn out as we hope. I suggest you say goodbye to your father, he said, placing a hand on her shoulder in a gesture of support. Jessica felt the weight of responsibility and uncertainty. Every word from the doctor seemed a warning, a way to prepare her for the inevitable, but she refused to give in to fear. I know, but he's strong, and I need to believe he'll make it. Please just do whatever is possible. I won't say goodbye because I have faith that he'll make it, she responded, trying to convince herself that her choice wasn't just useless stubbornness. As the doctor left to prepare for the surgery, Jessica leaned over Edward, holding his hand tighter. Dad, I know you can fight. I know you're strong. And I'll be here waiting for you, she whispered, her eyes fixed on his face as if her words could reach the deepest parts of his consciousness and keep him steady. The unsteady sound of the machines was a constant reminder of the danger, but she chose to ignore it, preferring to focus on the promise she had just made. She would stay there by his side until the very last moment, resisting fear and clinging to hope, however small. The cold white light of the operating room seemed to intensify the gravity of the situation. Doctor. Harris looked at the monitors, reflecting Edward's rising intracranial pressure to critical levels. Every second seemed a challenge, and the team knew that any fluctuation could be enough to turn the surgery into a lost battle even before it began. We need to be ready. Every detail counts now, thought Dr. Harris, aware that the slightest error could seal Edward's fate. Outside, Jessica watched everything from the waiting room, her face marked by fatigue and fear. Through the small window, she saw the medical team moving with precision, adjusting each instrument and checking every detail. The glass barrier that separated her from the room seemed also an insurmountable abyss, a distance that prevented her from helping her father. He needs me, and all I can do is watch, she muttered, feeling powerless and frustrated, while tightly gripping the edge of her chair. As the doctors organized the surgical environment with almost mechanical precision, Jessica delved into childhood memories. She remembered her father as a strong, invincible man, someone who never backed down from a challenge. Now he was there, vulnerable and fragile, at the mercy of a situation that no amount of money or power in the world could solve. Please, Dad, you've always been my fortress. I need you to fight for me, she thought, a solitary tear rolling down as she watched her father lying on the stretcher, surrounded by machines. Inside the room, Dr. Harris guided his team, each one assuming strategic positions and reviewing the procedure. Edward's neurosurgery would be one of the riskiest and most delicate procedures they had ever faced. The nurses prepared an arsenal of instruments, forceps, scalpels, probes, and other tools necessary for the operation. Every movement was made with precision, like a well-rehearsed dance, where any mistake could be fatal. We have to be prepared for everything. We cannot make mistakes, said Dr. Harris, trying to keep the team focused and calm, despite the evident tension on every face. Jessica, on the other side of the glass, watched every detail, her anxiety growing with each passing minute. Seeing Edward, always so strong, now vulnerable and at the mercy of the doctors, was almost unbearable. "He's always been my protector, and now he's the one who needs help," she whispered, clasping her hands as if in prayer, feeling torn between hope and despair. The silence of the waiting room seemed to amplify her suffering, and she felt like a spectator in a nightmare she couldn't wake up from. The medical team adjusted the monitors, and the readings showed dangerous fluctuations in Edward's intracranial pressure. The nurses exchanged glances, aware that the slightest slip could lead to a collapse. Dr. Harris kept his gaze fixed on the readings, each second demanding more concentration. He knew the operation was a race against time, and he needed to act swiftly, but with millimetric precision. "We'll do our best to keep him stable, but we have no margin for error. He only has a 2% chance," he warned, his voice grave and controlled. The tension in the waiting room increased, and Jessica felt every second as an eternity. She knew that Edward's fate was in the hands of the medical team, and the powerlessness of merely watching was torture. "I need to be strong for him, as he has always been for me," she thought, while memories of her father encouraged her to keep hope. But at the same time, the fear of losing him consumed her, and she wondered if he would have the strength to overcome this challenge. Suddenly, Dr. Harris noticed an even greater fluctuation in the monitors, and his eyes narrowed, focused on the emerging emergency. Edward's body began to convulse in violent spasms, a severe seizure manifesting with frightening intensity. "I need help here, quickly," shouted Dr. Harris, and the team rushed to contain the situation, trying to stabilize Edward before the seizure caused irreversible damage. On the other side of the glass, Jessica saw her father's body shake uncontrollably, and despair overcame her. She felt her legs fail, and her heart raced erratically as she tried to understand what was happening. "Please, not now." "Not after all this," she murmured, her hands covering her mouth as she watched helplessly. Dr. Harris moved the instruments with precision, and the environment around him seemed to carry a charge of electricity and tension. Everyone was in a state of maximum concentration, their eyes fixed on the monitors and Edward's vital signs, which oscillated as if they were a tightrope about to break. "We need to keep him stable at all costs." "We can't lose control now," murmured Dr. Harris, his voice almost muffled by his absolute focus. Meanwhile, the anesthesiologist, positioned next to Edward, kept a watchful eye on the signs. He knew that the slightest fluctuation could mean a life-threatening risk for the patient, and any mistake at this moment was unacceptable. Suddenly, the numbers began to drop, and the anesthesiologist frowned. "Dr. Harris, we have instability in the vital signs. We need to adjust the anesthesia, or he could decompensate," he alerted, his voice tense but controlled as he tried to keep Edward as stable as possible. Outside, Jessica waited, her hands clasped and her gaze fixed on the clock, as if each second passed slower than the previous one. She knew her father was in the hands of a highly trained team, but the fear of losing someone so important was still a constant shadow. "Dad, please, you have to hold on. Don't give up now," she whispered to herself, struggling to hold back the tears that stubbornly accumulated. Inside the room, Dr. Harris and his team advanced with care. Every movement was made with surgical precision, a dance of skills amidst a situation that bordered on the unsustainable. With the view magnified by the microscopes, Dr. Harris could visualize the extent of the bleeding, but soon noticed something that worried him. "We have a greater amount of blood than expected. This complicates access to the aneurysm," he commented with a serious expression, while the nurses around exchanged worried glances. The revelation that the bleeding was more extensive than expected put the entire team on high alert. Dr. Harris's hands, though steady, were tense, and he had to pause for a brief moment to assess the best approach. "Every second counts. We can't stop now. We need to access the aneurysm as soon as possible," he instructed, his voice revealing the seriousness of the situation. The anesthesiologist continued to monitor Edward, carefully adjusting the doses. "We're at the limit. Any change and he could decompensate," muttered the anesthesiologist, his voice low but laden with concern. Jessica, in the waiting room, felt as if she were in an endless nightmare. Each minute seemed like an eternity, and the silence around her was overwhelming. She remembered the times her father encouraged her never to give up, to be strong in the face of challenges. Now she prayed that he would find within himself the same strength. "I know you can overcome this, Dad. You're stronger than anyone can imagine, she thought, trying to cling to that hope as if it were a last thread. Inside the room, Dr. Harris advanced with the procedure, trying to work around the problem, but the process was delicate. Any more pressure could worsen the situation and make access to the aneurysm impossible. He moved the scalpel with extreme caution, while the team held their breath, each one aware that the slightest error would be disastrous. "We need more suction here, the field is too obscured," he instructed, his voice firm but with a note of urgency that increased the tension. Time passed, and the medical team fought against it. Every move Dr. Harris made was executed with almost surgical precision, and the assistants kept the environment under control, even with the increasing risk of failure. Jessica outside continued to watch the doctor's movements through the glass. Her eyes never left her father's face, even knowing he was unconscious. He needs to win this battle. "I can't bear to lose him," she thought, and her mind sought memories of the moments when he encouraged her to be strong, to never give up. Suddenly, on the monitor, Edward's vital signs began to oscillate again. The anesthesiologist looked at Dr. Harris, his expression tense. "We're seeing a drop in vitals. Blood pressure is fluctuating wildly," he warned, trying to stabilize Edward as quickly as possible. Dr. Harris sighed deeply, aware that the operation was becoming riskier by the second. "Keep monitoring. We need to reach the aneurysm before the situation worsens," he instructed. And the team responded with a silent nod, aware of the delicate nature of the task. The access to the aneurysm was nearly complete when Dr. Harris realized it was even more severe than he had imagined. He adjusted his position, approaching with extreme caution, mindful that any additional pressure could cause a rupture. He looked at the surgical field and took a deep breath, focusing on the most critical part of the procedure. "Now is the crucial moment. We need calm and precision," he said, as everyone around seemed to hold their breath. The instant he finally positioned the instrument to manipulate the aneurysm, a shrill sound rang out on the monitor, indicating a new change in Edward's vital signs. The anesthesiologist made a desperate attempt to stabilize him, but it was evident they were at the limit. "Dr. Harris, vitals are dangerously low. I don't know if he can hold on much longer," the anesthesiologist warned, and the tension in the room intensified. Jessica's heart raced as she watched every move from outside with a mixture of despair and hope. She didn't know exactly what was happening, but she felt it was the decisive moment. "Please, Dad, don't go now, please." "God, I beg you, don't take him," she whispered, clinging to a thread of hope even as everything around her seemed about to crumble. Inside the operating room, Dr. Harris made one final attempt to access the aneurysm, with the precision of someone who knows they are walking a fine line between success and failure. However, as he adjusted the instrument to control the aneurysm, an explosion of red flooded the surgical field. The aneurysm had ruptured during the manipulation. The atmosphere in the operating room was thick with an almost tangible tension. Dr. Harris kept his eyes fixed on the surgical field, moving his hands with calculated precision, each movement meticulously controlled. After hours of meticulous work, he had managed to visualize the aneurysm, a small pulsating bulge that threatened the delicate network of blood vessels. With each pulse, the aneurysm seemed to defy him, as if at any moment it would burst under the weight of its own fragility. "It's now or never," thought Dr. Harris, feeling the weight of that moment intensify. Around him, the medical team remained motionless, almost holding their breath as they awaited further instructions. They knew they were at the decisive moment. The assistants prepared what would be used to contain the aneurysm, each movement almost choreographed in perfect synchrony. "We need calm and precision. One mistake and everything could crumble," murmured Dr. Harris, more to himself than to the team. He struggled to keep his hands steady, but the risk involved was overwhelming. On the other side of the room, the anesthesiologist watched the monitor with redoubled attention, for he knew that any variation in Edward's vital signs could be a warning sign. "Intracranial pressure is still high but stable," he reported, with a controlled voice but laden with tension. Edward's pressure fluctuated between extreme highs and lows, as if his body were waging a silent battle against time. "We don't have much time, Dr. Harris. We need to act quickly," he insisted, casting a worried glance at the surgeon. Dr. Harris knew that every second was precious, and the urgency in the anesthesiologist's voice only served to intensify the pressure he already felt. He took a deep breath and refocused, trying to block out any distractions. "Let's proceed. Keep the field as clean as possible without interruptions," he instructed, as he prepared for the final step. With an almost surgical precision, knowing that any wrong move could be fatal, he began to contain the disease. One step at a time, he thought, trying to control the tremor that threatened his hand. Meanwhile, Jessica remained in the waiting room, completely oblivious to the technical details of the surgery, but fully aware of the danger her father faced. Each passing minute seemed to increase the weight she carried. The silence of the hospital corridor was interrupted only by the ticking of the clock, each sound a cruel reminder of her powerlessness. She clasped her hands tightly, her eyes fixed on the small window that overlooked the operating room, as if she could see through the walls. "You've been through so much, Dad. This will be just another obstacle," she whispered, feeling overwhelmed by a mixture of despair and hope. Inside the room, Dr. Harris advanced, each movement careful and calculated. When he finally came close to succeeding, he felt a slight tremor run through his body. He knew he had completed the riskiest stage, but the work was far from done. "I've contained the aneurysm. Now we need to stabilize the field and check for any leaks," he said, his voice laden with a restrained determination. The clip was secure, but he knew any failure could cause a relapse. The anesthesiologist, attentive to Edward's vital signs, relaxed slightly upon seeing that the levels were stabilizing. "Blood pressure is decreasing, but we still need to monitor closely," he cautioned, not taking his eyes off the monitors. The momentary silence in the room was a small victory, but everyone knew the situation was still critical. Dr. Harris nodded, but his concentration remained fixed on the surgical field. "We're almost there, just a few more steps," he thought, trying to stay calm. Jessica outside watched the movement of the doctors through the glass with growing anxiety. Time seemed to pass slowly, and every second was a mixture of hope and fear. Memories of her father encouraging her to be strong, to never give up, echoed in her mind. "Please, God, I just need one miracle. Just one," she whispered, as silent tears streamed down her face. She clutched the crucifix she wore around her neck, trying to hold on to anything that could give her strength. Inside the room, the team worked in perfect synchronization, checking the containment points around the aneurysm to ensure everything was in order. Dr. Harris gestured for them to adjust the lighting and allow him to perform one final check. The operation had been technically successful, but he knew there was still a long way to go to ensure a full recovery. "The critical phase is complete. Now it's a matter of stabilizing and monitoring," he said, allowing himself a small sigh of relief. The anesthetist observed Edward's vital signs, which were now maintaining a more controlled rhythm. "He's stable. For now," he commented, but his voice still carried a tone of caution. The whole team, although relieved, knew that Edward remained in a delicate state, and any mistake could reverse the progress made. Dr. Harris looked at the patient, feeling the weight of responsibility still on his shoulders. "I did my part. Now it's up to you, Edward," he thought, silently hopeful. After the procedure was completed, the team began preparing Edward to be transferred to the ICU, where he would be kept under observation. Dr. Harris removed his surgical gloves, and the sound of the latex being removed echoed through the room. A simple sound that marked the end of one of the most tense procedures of his career. He knew the risk of complications was still high, but at that moment all he could do was wait. The procedure was a success, but we'll see if he remains in a coma. "We'll closely monitor his vital signs," he explained to the team in a professional yet slightly relieved tone. Jessica, who was observing from outside, felt a brief relief as she saw the team starting to remove the equipment from the room, an indication that the operation had ended. When Dr. Harris came out to give her the news, she quickly stood up, her heart racing. "Doctor, is he going to be okay?" she asked, her voice trembling with expectation and apprehension. The doctor gently placed a hand on her shoulder, his eyes understanding. "We managed to control the aneurysm, but we still have to see if he wakes up from the coma. His condition is delicate, and now we need time and patience," he explained. And Jessica felt a wave of emotions wash over her. She nodded, trying to process what that meant. Her father was alive, but there was still a long way ahead. "Thank you, Doctor. Thank you for not giving up," she murmured. Her voice choked as she felt a mixture of relief and uncertainty. The dim light of the hospital room illuminated Thomas's weary face. His eyes blinked a few times, adjusting to the brightness, and he seemed confused, trying to recognize his surroundings. Sarah, seated by the bedside, watched his every slight movement, her heart racing. When he finally opened his eyes and looked in her direction, she felt a wave of relief and emotion overflow. "Grandpa, you're awake," she whispered, holding his hands tightly, as if afraid he might disappear at any moment. Thomas tried to smile, although his face was pale and tired. "My little one, where are we? What happened?" he murmured, his voice weak but full of affection. Sarah swallowed hard, feeling the weight of recent events fall on her shoulders. She knew she needed to tell him everything, but the words seemed to jumble together. "Grandpa, it was all so scary. I've never felt so afraid," she confessed, her voice trembling slightly as she looked at him. She took a deep breath and began to explain, her heart still racing with recent memories. "How can I start telling you everything that happened? Well, I saw that you needed medication, so I went to sell flowers to buy more. I did what I could on the street and tried to sell as many as possible to get money for the medicine, but no one wanted to help. The rain was heavy and no one stopped. Then I met a man. Edward," she explained while her grandfather watched her attentively. Thomas frowned, absorbing every word as if trying to understand how grave the situation had been. "He was wealthy, but he helped me, bought all the flowers. And when I said you were ill, he came with me to help you and asked his driver to take us here," Sarah said, her voice filled with sincere gratitude. Thomas's eyes filled with emotion as he heard about Edward's sacrifice. He did all that for us? A stranger?" he asked, his voice low and full of surprise. Sarah nodded, trying to explain how that unknown man had become such a significant presence. "Yes, Grandpa. He didn't even know me, but he cared about you. And then he ended up needing help too. His surgery was today," she replied, feeling a lump in her throat as she remembered how much Edward had risked for them. Sarah took a deep breath, trying to put into words the fear she had felt. "It was horrible, Grandpa, seeing you there, not responding. And then knowing Edward was in danger too, I felt like I was going to lose you both at the same time," she confessed, as a tear finally rolled down her cheek. Thomas reached out his trembling hand and gently wiped her face. "My girl, you were braver than anyone could ever imagine. I couldn't be more proud of you," he whispered, emotional. She tried to smile, but the weight of everything was still present in her heart. "I just wish everything was different. I wish you had been well from the start and that Edward hadn't gotten hurt because of me," she murmured, almost as if blaming herself. Thomas shook his head slightly, trying to reassure her. "No, my little one. What he did was a choice of a kind heart. He saw something special in you, just as I do. Never blame yourself for that," he said, with a firm and affectionate look. Sarah nodded, trying to absorb her grandfather's words, but she still felt divided between gratitude and guilt. "I wish I could thank him for everything he did," she said softly, looking at the door as if expecting Edward to walk in at any moment. Thomas squeezed her hand again, with an affection only a grandfather could have. "You'll have that chance. I'm sure he'll recover," he replied, with a serene confidence that brought some relief to her heart. At that moment, Jessica entered the room with a tired expression but a slight smile. Sarah looked at her hopefully, and Jessica nodded, confirming the girl's silent question. "The surgery is over. My father was taken to his room, and now it's just a matter of time and patience," she explained, trying to convey confidence to both Sarah and Thomas. The days passed slowly, each moment laden with expectation and tension. After several tests, Thomas received the news that he was ready to go home, but to everyone's surprise, he refused immediate discharge. "I can't leave now. I need to be here by Edward's side until the end," he declared, with a determination that made the doctor nod in respect. Jessica, Sarah, and the others understood the feeling that moved Thomas. Edward was not just an unknown millionaire to them. He was a man who had risked everything for Thomas and Sarah. Edward's room became a meeting point for everyone's daily visits, anxiously awaiting a sign, any movement that indicated he was coming back to them. Every morning, Thomas would sit by Edward's bedside and tell a story. "I'll tell you about a day when my granddaughter Sarah and I planted sunflowers in the backyard. She was small and we had to wait months to see the first sprout emerge," he would say. holding Edward's hand like a dear friend. "Everything has its time, my friend. I know you'll find your time too," he would murmur, as if his words could awaken the sleeping man. Sarah spent much of her day at the hospital, sitting beside her grandfather as he waited patiently and tirelessly. "You know, Grandpa, it seems like Edward is like our sunflowers, doesn't it? It seems like he's just waiting for the right moment to show up," she would say, trying to smile. Thomas would nod, smiling at his granddaughter with an affectionate look. "Yes, my little one. I think he just needs a little more sun," he would reply, holding Sarah's hand and trying to pass the same confidence on to her. Each day brought a new story, a new shared memory. Jessica, who was more reserved, observed everything in silence, although she felt a constant tightness in her chest. She realized how grateful these people were to her father and how his kindness had touched their lives. "He never told me anything like what he did for you, Sarah. He never mentioned what he did for others," she thought, feeling a pang of regret and sadness for not having known this side of him before. However, as the days went by, Jessica began to realize that Edward remained motionless, his face serene but absent. Each story seemed to be a grain of hope deposited in his soul, but with each new day without a response, that hope weakened a little. "Dad, what are you waiting for? We're all here waiting for you to come back," she would whisper to him, holding his hand and feeling the weight of her decision. Thomas, even frail, remained faithful to his daily routine of visits. He and Sarah made sure to bring small mementos to the room, like flowers or little drawings made by Sarah. "Here, Edward, we brought you a flower from the garden. I know you can't see it now, but I think you'll like the smell," Thomas would say, placing the small flower beside Edward's bed. He hoped that one day, when he opened his eyes, Edward could see everything they had done. One night, Jessica was alone in the room with Edward. The silence around was almost absolute, broken only by the sounds of the machines monitoring his vital signs. She looked at her father, her heart tight with the idea she had avoided for days. She knew he had always been firm in his decisions, someone who valued dignity above all else. "Dad, you always told me you hated depending on others, hated the idea of living trapped in a bed," she murmured, her voice trembling. She knew she might be approaching an inevitable decision. As the days continued to pass, the hope that once shone brightly began to fade. With each visit, Jessica observed her father in the same condition, motionless, with no sign of consciousness. His face was a mix of serenity and detachment, as if he were in a distant place, unable to hear or feel anything around him. "Maybe he's at peace. Maybe he's already gone, even though his body is still here," she thought, feeling her chest tighten. Thomas noticed Jessica's growing discouragement and tried to give her words of comfort. "You know, my daughter, life sometimes surprises us. I've seen many who came back when everything seemed lost. Maybe Edward will surprise us too," he said, trying to maintain optimism. Jessica forced a smile, grateful for Thomas's attempt, but in her heart, doubt still persisted. "Thank you, Thomas, but I don't know how long I can hold on to that hope," she replied, feeling the weight of each word. At the last visits, Jessica no longer hid the weariness and anguish in her gaze. Sarah, who had always been optimistic, also began to question whether Edward would ever wake up. "Grandpa, is Edward just sleeping a lot, or has he gone away and we don't know?" she asked innocently, while holding her grandfather's hand. Thomas caressed his granddaughter's hair, not knowing how to respond. "I don't know, my dear, but I know his heart is still here, and that's what matters," he replied, although the uncertainty also affected him. Finally, one night when Jessica was alone by Edward's side, she felt the weight of the decision fall upon her in an almost suffocating way. Sitting beside his bed, she held her father's hand and stared intently at his motionless face. "Dad, you always taught me to be strong, to make difficult decisions. But how can I let you go?" she murmured, feeling tears filling her eyes. She knew that perhaps she was prolonging the suffering of both of them. With a heavy heart, Jessica made a decision. She stood up and looked at her father one last time, as if seeking some confirmation, some sign that would make her change her mind. But silence was her only answer. "I will honor what I believe you wanted, what you always asked for," she whispered, the tears finally flowing freely down her face. The next day, the silence in the room was oppressive. Each sound of the monitoring machines seemed a grim reminder that Edward's time was running out. Jessica, Thomas, and Sarah were gathered around the bed, and the expression on each of their faces reflected the weight of that moment. Jessica took a deep breath, gathering strength to speak, though the pain in her chest made any words difficult. "Dad, we are here. We came to see you, to tell you how much you mean to us," she began, her voice trembling and almost whispered, as if afraid to break the fragile silence. She held his hand, his cold and lifeless fingers intertwined with hers. Thomas watched, feeling a deep pain inside. He had only known Edward in passing, but the sacrifice he had made had touched his life in a way that words could not describe. "Edward, I don't know if you can hear me, but I want you to know that I am eternally grateful. You changed our lives. Thanks to you, I can still see my granddaughter's smile every day," he murmured, trying to control his emotion. Sarah, her eyes brimming with tears, held the small bouquet of flowers she had brought, as if she wanted to offer a parting gift. "Edward, you were like a hero to me," she whispered, clutching the bouquet against her chest. "I wish you could see how you inspired me. These flowers they're for you. It's the most beautiful thing I have, and I hope you feel how you touched me," she said, gently placing the bouquet beside the bed, trying to hold back the tears that were already rolling down her face. Jessica looked at her father, her heart tight, knowing she needed to say what she had never had the courage to say before. "Dad, you were always more than you appeared. Your relentless strength in business, your sacrifice, everything you did for us, for me, I never thanked you enough," she murmured, her voice choked. She knew that this might be the last moment she had the chance to express her feelings. "I'm sorry for not realizing sooner how incredible you were. I wish I had told you this while you could still hear me," she continued, finally letting the tears fall. Time seemed to slow down as they remained there, each one immersed in their own farewells. Thomas closed his eyes for a moment, as if he were saying a silent prayer, asking for a miracle, for a chance for Edward. "We didn't want it to be like this, my friend. But if this is your time, may you go in peace. May you know that you left a mark on each one of us," Thomas whispered, squeezing Jessica's shoulder, who became even more emotional. Sarah stared fixedly at Edward, her childlike eyes trying to comprehend the gravity of the situation. She wished more than anything that he would simply wake up, that he would open his eyes and smile at her. "Edward, if you can hear me, please come back. We're not ready to say goodbye," the girl murmured, her voice broken, her face still wet from tears. She reached out, touching his arm, as if the simple touch could awaken him. Jessica, still holding her father's hand, felt a tightness in her chest as she realized that Edward remained motionless. The reality of the situation seemed to settle on her shoulders, heavy and inevitable. "I wish so much that everything was different, that you were here by my side as always," she murmured, her voice almost inaudible. She felt like a child, waiting for something she knew might never happen. She lowered her head, her face covered by a shadow of deep sadness. The silence was broken only by the constant beeps of the machines, each sound echoing in the room as a reminder of the delicate situation. Thomas and Sarah moved closer, trying to console Jessica with their presence, although words were insufficient to express what they felt. "We're here with you, Jessica. He will always be in our hearts no matter what happens," Thomas said, while Sarah silently nodded, holding Jessica's hand in a gesture of support. Jessica sighed, her chest tight with the pain of the farewell that seemed increasingly real. She looked at her father, trying to memorize every detail of his face, every line and every mark. "I don't know if I'm ready to let you go, Dad, but maybe that's what you want," she murmured, as tears silently streamed down her face. The decision seemed to approach her with a cruel inevitability. Then, in the midst of that moment of sadness and farewell, something almost imperceptible happened. Jessica felt a slight movement under her fingers, a simple tremor in Edward's hand. She widened her eyes, barely believing what she was feeling. "Dad, was that you?" she whispered, her heart beating uncontrollably as she tried to understand what had just happened. Thomas and Sarah, noticing the change in Jessica's expression, approached, their looks filled with hope and disbelief. "Did he move? Was that what you felt, Jessica?" Thomas asked, his face lit up with an expression of surprise and expectation. Jessica nodded, still in shock, her eyes fixed on her father's hand as if expecting him to move again. Sarah, emotional, gently held Edward's arm, her voice full of hope. "Edward, are you there? Can you hear us?" she whispered, almost in a prayer. Edward slowly opened his eyes, blinking a few times as if emerging from a deep and confusing sleep. The room seemed muffled, and the soft ceiling light seemed to slightly daze him. Around him, Jessica, Thomas, and Sarah watched anxiously, their gazes filled with relief but also expectation. Jessica gently held his hand, trying to hold back tears of emotion. "Dad, you're awake," she whispered, a trembling smile forming on her face, as if that moment was a dream that had finally become reality. Edward slowly opened his eyes, blinking several times, as if the soft light of the hospital room was bothering him. He looked around, his gaze laden with confusion, almost as if he were in a completely unfamiliar place. His brow furrowed as he observed the faces around him, a deep emptiness reflected in his eyes. Jessica, noticing her father's hesitation and lost look, felt a wave of relief and fear at the same time. She leaned toward him, her voice laden with expectation. "Dad, you're here. You've come back to us," she whispered, hoping he would react. Edward, however, continued to stare at her, his eyes slightly narrowed but without recognition. He opened his mouth, trying to form words, and then shook his head slightly, as if trying to shake off the fog from his mind. Where am I? Who are you?" His voice was low, hoarse, and each word seemed to weigh on him, as if it carried a disconcerting doubt. Jessica felt her blood run cold upon hearing those words, a feeling of despair beginning to take hold of her. "Dad, it's me. Jessica, your daughter," she said, her voice trembling, trying to reach some spark of memory in him. But Edward continued to look at her as if she were a stranger, which made her heart tighten even more. I don't remember." "I don't know who you are. I don't know where I am," he mumbled, his voice laden with a confusion that seemed to grow. Noticing Edward's state, Thomas placed a hand on Jessica's shoulder, trying to comfort her. He approached the bed, his voice gentle and cautious. "Edward, we're your friends. You helped my granddaughter, Sarah," he said in a soft tone, almost as if he were telling a story. Edward, however, averted his gaze, and his expression was that of someone who was lost amidst a nightmare. "I can't remember," he replied, his tone heavy and disoriented. Sarah's expression, who was standing beside her grandfather, shifted from surprise to sadness as she heard Edward say he couldn't remember anyone. She looked at Jessica, her gaze full of questions and concerns. "He doesn't remember anything?" she whispered to her grandmother as the reality of the situation began to settle in her heart. Thomas, noticing Edward's puzzled expression, tried to lighten the mood, smiling at him as if he were a long-time friend. "Stay calm, you've just been through a surgery, but you're fine now," he said, trying to keep his tone light. But in response, Edward only looked at him with an air of perplexity, as if he had no idea who this man was who spoke with such enthusiasm. I don't know where I am," Edward mumbled, his voice trembling and hesitant. He looked around again as if he were in a strange place, surrounded by faces he couldn't recognize. Sarah, who was standing beside him with wide eyes, pulled Jessica's hand, nervous. "Why isn't he remembering?" she whispered, scared, trying to understand what was happening. Jessica felt her heart racing, a growing panic taking hold of her. "Dad, please. It's me, your daughter. I'm Jessica, you remember?" She held his hand tighter, trying somehow to bring back a memory, a connection. But Edward continued to look at her with a blank expression, as if she were a complete stranger. "I don't remember. I don't know who I am," he confessed, the confusion in his voice revealing the fear that was also beginning to take hold of him. At that moment, Thomas realized the gravity of the situation and ran to the door to call a doctor. "We need help here." "Something's wrong with him," he shouted, his voice filled with urgency. Jessica continued to hold her father's hand, her eyes welled with tears as she tried to process what that meant. He was so close, and now he seemed so distant from us, she thought, feeling her heart tightened with pain and despair. Minutes later, a doctor entered the room, followed by a team of nurses who promptly approached Edward to check his vital signs. "Mr. Edward, I'm here to help. Do you know your name?" the doctor asked, trying to maintain a calm and understanding tone, but Edward only shook his head in denial with a lost look. "I don't know where I am or who I am." "Who are these people?" he mumbled, gesturing toward Jessica, Thomas, and Sarah. The answer was like a stab in Jessica's heart. The pain of seeing her own father, who had always been her fortress, now so vulnerable and unable to recognize her, was something she had never imagined she would face. "Dad, please try to remember. Anything. I'm your daughter, I'm your family," she pleaded, her voice choked with tears. But Edward only looked away, unable to recognize the love and anguish that overflowed from her. The doctor motioned for the nurses to adjust the monitors around Edward and approached Jessica. These symptoms can be normal after a procedure like the one he went through. Memory loss may be temporary, but we need time to evaluate him, he explained in a professional tone, but Jessica couldn't feel reassured. The idea that her father might never return to the way she knew him terrified her. Thomas, who observed the scene in silence, felt sadness invade his heart. He couldn't imagine a man as strong as Edward being reduced to a shadow of himself. "Edward, you'll get through this. You'll remember. Everything will be all right," he said, trying to approach, but Edward only looked away as if those words meant nothing to him. "No, it won't be all right, I don't remember," he replied, his voice low and full of anguish. Sarah, who was still holding her grandfather's hand, looked at Edward with wide eyes, unable to understand how he could have forgotten everything. "You're our hero, Edward. You were the one who helped me. How can you not remember?" she said, her voice trembling. But instead of an answer, Edward just stared at her, his gaze still lost in a sea of confusion. The doctors assessed the situation and decided to sedate Edward for a while, trying to alleviate the anxiety he was showing and give the team a chance to organize the next steps. Jessica watched as the medication began to take effect, seeing her father close his eyes again, but this time in an induced and temporary sleep. It was painful to see that man who had always been her rock now so vulnerable, lost in a world without memories. She sighed, her heart heavy, but determined to help him find his way back. "I won't give up on you, Dad. I'll do everything in my power," she whispered, gently holding his hand. As Edward slept, Jessica stayed by his side, reminiscing about moments from her own childhood, small memories she hoped to use as a key to unlock her father's memory. When he finally began to wake up, she moved closer, ready to try anything that could bring back a spark of recognition. He opened his eyes slowly, the same initial confusion in his gaze, but this time there was less despair. He looked at Jessica, and she took the opportunity to start talking, as if they were just having a conversation on a normal day. "Dad, do you remember the house I grew up in?" she began, trying to keep her voice light as if it were a nostalgic conversation. "It was a small house with a wooden porch where you'd put flowers in pots. I always helped you take care of them, remember?" Edward looked at her, his eyes expressing a mixture of confusion and curiosity. "Flowers? Porch?" he mumbled, his voice uncertain, but it seemed like something in his mind was trying to grasp the image she had described. Jessica smiled, feeling a spark of hope. "Yes, Dad. You always said that flowers needed care and patience, that you had to wait for their time. I think that was the first lesson in patience you taught me," she continued, keeping her tone soft, hoping that each word was like a piece of a puzzle he could put together. She saw his expression soften slightly, but it was still as if he were trying to reach for something through a thick haze. "You always said that if we cared for the flowers with love, they would grow strong. And in the spring our porch would be covered in colors. It was our favorite place, remember?" she insisted, watching his every reaction carefully. Edward blinked slowly, as if he were trying to see through a dirty window. "Flowers. Colors. It's familiar, but I'm not sure," he murmured, and Jessica felt her heart fill with hope, although he was still distant. Determined to continue, Jessica changed the subject, trying another memory that might bring Edward closer to her. "Dad, and our walks in the park. You always took me there on Sundays. We'd bring a basket with fruit, and I loved chasing the ducks while you laughed and called me back," she said, smiling as she reminisced. "You said I had the energy of 10 kids, and that one day you'd need an engine to keep up with me," she added, laughing lightly, hoping that would bring a smile to his face too. Edward frowned, as if the sound of her laughter had awakened a distant memory, an echo in his mind. He opened his mouth to speak, but closed it again, as if he were trying to capture something that was slipping through his fingers. "Park. Children. Laughter," he repeated, almost to himself, his voice low and full of uncertainty. Jessica saw a glimmer of recognition in his eyes, but it soon disappeared, and she realized she needed to persist. Jessica took a deep breath and continued with another story, one of her favorites. Do you remember the first time we tried to build a treehouse? I insisted so much, and you ended up climbing up with me, but you were never good with heights, she recounted, smiling, remembering the fear her father showed even though he tried to hide it. You were more terrified than I was, but you didn't give up. You stayed up there with me until I felt safe, and then climbed down quickly saying you'd never do that again, she said, laughing softly, and waited anxiously for a response. This time Edward smiled slightly, an almost imperceptible movement, but enough for Jessica to notice. Treehouse, I think I can see that. Something like wood. You, and the fear, he murmured, his eyes filling with an emotion that seemed like the tip of an almost erased memory. Jessica squeezed his hand, feeling that she was getting closer, that each story was illuminating small fragments of the past. You always did everything for me, even the things that made you uncomfortable, Jessica said, her voice choked. After my teenage years, your business became very successful. You became a wealthy man, and your work obligations were incessant, and that distanced us. But I never thanked you for everything you did, Dad. Only now do I understand how much you taught me, how much I am a part of you, she continued, feeling tears well up in her eyes. She held his hand as if that gesture could keep him there, even though his mind was still far away. Edward looked at her, his expression slightly softer. I feel it. Even without remembering everything, I feel she's my daughter, he said in a soft and hesitant tone, but there was something new in the way he observed her. Jessica nodded, holding his hand more firmly, her heart filled with hope. Yes, Dad. I'm your daughter, and I'm here with you now and always, she murmured, trying to contain the emotion that overflowed. She knew that moment was the beginning of something new. The next day, the sun peeked through the hospital window, and the soft morning light touched Edward's face delicately, warming it and bringing a sense of peace. His eyes opened slowly, adjusting to the brightness that bathed the room in a welcoming tone. He blinked a few times, as if waking from a deep sleep, and gradually began to realize that he was exactly where he was supposed to be. The weight of confusion that once filled his mind had disappeared, replaced by a calm clarity that enveloped him like an embrace. He felt every detail of that moment, every particle of light and sound, as if he were finally back in his own body. By his side, holding his hand with tenderness and tension, was Jessica, his daughter. Her face, marked by sleepless nights, displayed the dark circles of one who carried hope and fatigue in equal measures. Edward studied her face, noticing every detail, the moist eyes, the expectant expression. Without hesitation, he squeezed her hand back and murmured, with a voice still hoarse but full of love, "Jessica." His voice came out as a whisper, but that simple word was like a ray of light for Jessica, who was surprised to hear him call her name. Her eyes widened and filled with tears, unable to believe what she was hearing. "Dad, you remember me?" she asked, her voice trembling with emotion as she leaned closer to him, as if fearing that moment would be just a dream. Edward smiled slightly, his eyes still half closed, but his gaze more present than ever. "Yes, my daughter. I remember you. I remember everything," he replied, his tone full of a tenderness Jessica had not heard in a long time. She let out a sigh of relief, and the tears she had been holding back began to roll down her face. Soon after, Edward noticed a small figure beside Jessica. Sarah, the flower girl, watched him with a mixture of shyness and anxiety, holding a small bouquet with the flowers she always brought him. He looked at her, and her expression changed as she perceived the recognition in his gaze. "Sarah," he said softly, as a memory of the moment they met came back to him. "You're here, aren't you? The flower seller. You stayed here." Sarah smiled, moved, her eyes filled with gratitude and admiration. "Yes, I'm here, and you're here too, finally," she whispered, with a relieved smile. The moment was interrupted by a nurse who entered the room to check Edward's vitals. Upon seeing that he was awake and conscious, she immediately went to call the doctors. Within minutes, the room was filled with members of the medical team, each of them impressed by the fact that Edward was not only awake, but also with his mental faculties intact. One of the doctors approached, with a serious but hopeful look. "Mr. Edward, do you know where you are? Could you tell us what you remember? He asked, trying to assess the level of recovery. Edward took a deep breath, looking at each person in the room, feeling complete in a way he hadn't experienced in a long time. I know exactly where I am. I'm in the hospital. I got sick. I woke up here and had to sign some papers, he replied, with a smile that brought an air of optimism to the room. He then looked at Jessica, paternal love evident in his eyes. This is my daughter, Jessica. And this girl, Sarah. They stayed by my side all this time, didn't they? And your grandfather? He questioned with a soft but confident voice. He's fine, the girl replied, with an exultant smile as she saw Edward well. The doctor nodded, satisfied with the answer, but decided to conduct some simple tests to confirm the complete recovery of memory. He asked Edward to describe some detail of his life or personal history to make sure the memories were really back. Mr. Edward, could you tell me something about your childhood or your family? We just want to make sure everything is working perfectly, he requested, keeping a professional tone but with a slight smile. Edward laughed lightly, as if the fragments of his life were finally resurfacing. I remember the house where I grew up. It was small, but we had a huge garden full of flowers my mother planted, he recounted, his gaze distant but full of affection. She used to say that flowers were like life. You plant, you take care, and one day they bloom. And when I was little, I used to spend hours watching her plant and waiting for each flower that sprouted. Jessica's eyes shone as she heard her father mention such a personal and meaningful memory. The doctor smiled and nodded, satisfied with the answers. It seems everything is working well, Mr. Edward. Your memory has indeed returned, and we are very happy with the progress, he declared, as he noted the results on a clipboard. Jessica let out a relieved sigh and held her father's hand, grateful and emotional. I knew you would come back, Dad. I knew you wouldn't leave us like that, she whispered, squeezing his hand tightly. Edward looked at her, and for the first time in a long time he felt whole and present. Sarah, beside her grandfather, observed Edward with an expression of admiration and affection. She approached him, holding the bouquet of flowers she had brought. I brought these for you. I thought maybe you'd like them, she said, handing the flowers to Edward with a shy smile. He took the bouquet and inhaled the scent of the flowers, feeling connected to each person around him, especially the girl who had helped him so much. Thank you, Sarah. These flowers mean a lot to me. And so do you, he said, touched by the girl's kindness. Throughout the day, Edward underwent further tests which confirmed the complete recovery of his memory and health. The doctors were surprised and impressed by his resilience and determination. It's truly remarkable, Mr. Edward. Given the severity of your condition, many in your situation would not have had such a rapid and complete recovery, commented the chief physician as he signed the papers releasing Edward to return to his room, now only for observation. Jessica remained by her father's side throughout the process, watching him with a mixture of pride and relief. She knew he had been through one of the greatest trials of his life, and seeing her father back, with his personality and memories intact, was the greatest gift she could receive. Dad, I don't know how to tell you how much I've waited for this moment, she confessed, her eyes still shining with tears of happiness. Edward pulled her into an embrace, holding her as if to ensure she knew how much he loved her. I know, my daughter, and I won't forget it, he murmured, comforting her. That night, when all the tests were finally over, Edward was taken back to his room, where he could rest alongside his family and friends. He looked at Jessica and Sarah, feeling immensely grateful. I thought I might have lost you both forever, but being here with you is like living a new chance, he said, smiling at them both. Thomas, who came in for a brief visit, also could not contain his relief upon seeing Edward fully conscious. I knew you would come back. I knew I could still thank you for what you did for us. We had so much to live and share, he said, moved as he squeezed Edward's hand. The feeling of gratitude and hope filled the room, and Edward knew that each one of them was part of a new phase in his life. When night fell, Edward looked at Jessica one last time before falling asleep, feeling complete. After days of careful recovery in the hospital, Edward finally received the news everyone was eagerly awaiting. He was cleared to go home. The announcement brought a wave of relief and happiness to Jessica, Thomas, and Sarah, who had been by his side every day, witnessing each progress and supporting him at every moment. Edward, sitting on the bed, looked at them with a sincere smile, feeling truly blessed. So it's official. I can go home, he said, still surprised by his own recovery. Jessica smiled, wiping away a tear that escaped her eyes. "Yes, Dad. We can finally take you home," she replied, moved as she held his hand affectionately. Sarah, by her grandfather's side, watched Edward with admiration. To her, he was more than just a friend. He was a hero who risked everything to help them. "Can I see your house, Edward? I bet it's as beautiful as you are brave," she asked, her eyes shining with curiosity and anticipation. Edward laughed, touched by the girl's sincerity. "Of course you can, Sarah. I consider you and your grandfather part of my family now," he replied, looking at Thomas with a grateful smile. Thomas, moved, nodded his head, grateful to have crossed paths with such a kind-hearted man. "It will be an honor, Edward. I never imagined we could make such true friends," he said with a glint of admiration in his eyes. Hours later, the group left the hospital toward Edward's mansion, where he could finally recover fully, surrounded by comfort and those who had become his true friends. Upon arriving at the entrance of the mansion, Sarah was awestruck as she observed the imposing facade, with flowering gardens and a wide porch, just as she had imagined. "It's so beautiful, Edward. What a lovely place. I feel like a princess entering a palace," she exclaimed, holding her grandfather's hand, who smiled at the enchantment of his granddaughter. Seeing the joy in Sarah's eyes, Edward felt renewed, as if he had been given a second chance to appreciate the things he might have once considered trivial. "Well, a castle needs special people to make it truly magical. Today this place is even more beautiful with your presence," he said, opening the mansion's door and motioning for everyone to enter. Jessica observed the scene in silence, her heart warmed by her father's kindness. Throughout the day, Edward made sure to show every corner of the house to Thomas and Sarah, who explored with the enthusiasm of children discovering a new world. In the garden, Edward pointed out different flowers and plants, many of which he had cultivated himself with the help of dedicated gardeners. "These flowers represent the cycle of life to me. They teach us that even in the most difficult moments, there is always room for rebirth," he said, with a tranquil voice as Sarah caressed a flower. Jessica watched her father interact with Sarah and Thomas, surprised and moved by how much Edward had changed since the accident. He seemed lighter, more sensitive to the value of small things. "This time in the hospital made us see life differently, didn't it, Dad?" she asked, observing him with a smile. Edward nodded, his gaze distant but serene. "Yes, my daughter. I learned that nothing is more valuable than the people we choose to have by our side," he replied, with a glint of emotion in his eyes. Thomas, ever discreet, approached Edward, placing a hand on his shoulder in a gesture of friendship and gratitude. "Thank you, Edward, for bringing us into your life. I never thought we could build a friendship like this, but now I feel you are part of our family," he said, moved. Edward held his friend's hand firmly, feeling a profound gratitude. "The honor is all mine, Thomas. You taught me the true value of generosity," he replied in a tone laden with sincerity. Later, everyone gathered in the living room, where Jessica organized a small snack to celebrate her father's return. Sarah, excited, pulled Edward to one of the armchairs and asked him to tell a story from his childhood. "Please, Edward, I want to hear one of your stories. I bet you've done such brave things as what you did for me and my grandfather," she pleaded, her eyes shining. Edward laughed, remembering the adventures of his youth, and began to tell a story of when, as a child, he had ventured alone into a forest in search of treasure. Jessica and Thomas listened attentively, but the true joy for them was seeing the friendship that had formed between Edward and Sarah, as if that connection had been destined. "I've never seen him so happy, Dad. Perhaps life was saving this reunion to teach us a lesson," Jessica murmured to Thomas, who nodded with an approving smile. "Sometimes life offers us the right friends at the most unexpected moments," he agreed, as he watched Edward and Sarah laughing together. As the afternoon drew to a close, the atmosphere was filled with a tranquility that contrasted with the intense weeks everyone had experienced. Edward, sitting beside Jessica, looked at the garden and noticed there were new flowers blooming. He sighed, finally feeling at peace. "Everything seems to flourish again," he said, more to himself, but Jessica heard and nodded with a smile. "That's because, Father, you learn to see the value in every moment," she replied, holding his hand affectionately. As the sun began to set, Thomas looked at Sarah and gave a smile, signaling that it was time for them to leave. Sarah was reluctant to say goodbye, but approached Edward, who welcomed her with a warm embrace. "Come back any time. This is your home too," he said, as Sarah waved, smiling, her eyes filled with affection. Months later, life had resumed its course, but with significant changes for Edward and everyone around him. Since his recovery, he spent more time with Jessica and cherished every moment by her side, nurturing a relationship they had both let slip away over the years. The mansion, once a reserved and solitary place, was now filled with laughter and frequent visits from Thomas and Sarah. The flowery gardens, which Edward so appreciated, were now carefully tended by the four of them, transforming the space into a haven of peace and shared joy. On an autumn afternoon, Edward was sitting on the porch, contemplatively watching the swaying of the golden leaves. Sarah ran up to him, carrying in her hands a small pot with seedlings she had planted herself. "Look, Edward, these flowers will grow and you'll always remember me whenever you see them," she said with a radiant smile. He looked at her fondly, taking the pot and promising to care for the little plant as if it were a treasure. "I promise, Sarah." "They'll have the best spot in the garden," he replied, feeling grateful to have built this friendship with her. Thomas, for his part, became a confidant and advisor to Edward, and the two began to walk together in the garden every afternoon. They discussed life, exchanged experiences, and philosophized about the value of second chances. Edward felt that Thomas brought him a peace he had never found in his routine before, a serenity that helped him see life with new eyes. "You showed me that life is more than possessions or achievements, Thomas. It's about the bonds we create," Edward said, grateful. At nightfall, Jessica called everyone for dinner, where the table was filled with dishes they had prepared together. Each meal at the mansion had become a celebration of friendship and gratitude. As everyone chatted, laughed, and shared stories, Edward looked around, his heart filled with simple and genuine happiness. That night, as the group said their goodbyes, Edward watched Thomas and Sarah's car disappear down the road, and with a sigh, turned to Jessica, smiling. "I think these months taught me more than my entire life before that," he reflected. Jessica smiled and nodded. "And now, Father, what else can we learn together?" Edward smiled at Jessica's question, feeling the warmth of a promising future by her side. He looked at the illuminated mansion, now filled with life and happy memories, and realized that despite everything, life had given him a second chance not only to live, but to truly cherish every bond he had built. "I think we can learn to cultivate happiness in every small moment, like the flowers in our garden," he replied, holding his daughter's hand affectionately. As they walked back inside, Edward knew that from then on, love and friendship would be the true foundations of his renewed life. If you enjoyed this story, we invite you to like this video and subscribe to our channel. Your support motivates us to continue bringing exciting stories almost every day. Don't miss the next stunning narrative that is about to appear on your screen. We are immensely grateful to have you here with us. Now you can click on the links that are appearing on your screen right now. We have a special selection just for you, filled with valuable stories and guaranteed entertainment. See you there.